Let's talk about the opioid law. It's been a year and a half since you signed this law. What do you think's working well so far?
Well, we've certainly seen a big reduction in prescribing of opioids, and we've seen a ton of uptake in the use of the new, improved prescription monitoring program. And I think those two things are related. I think the prescriber community really appreciates the fact that they can get real-time data now on not just the prescription history of the person that is standing in front of them, but also they get history on their own prescribing and where they fit relative to their peers with respect to prescribing generally. And the drop in total number of prescriptions written has been significant, and the increase in the use of the tool has also been significant. I've talked to a lot of folks at medical schools, dental schools, pharmacy schools, and nursing schools. They've all said that incorporating the opioid therapy and pain management core into their curriculum has been a big win as far as they're concerned for their students. And we've significantly expanded our treatment capacity and also plugged some gaps in Massachusetts where literally we had nothing geographically. And I would say that those are all positive developments and have something to do with the reduction in both prescribing and deaths, which is the first time we've gone down year over year in 15 years. But we still have miles and miles to go.
You mentioned the overdose deaths being down. I think it's 5% for the first half of this year. Those are deaths, not necessarily a lowering in the number of actual overdoses. Yep. So the question becomes, are there fewer overdoses, or are just people being saved by Narcan?
I think part of it is Narcan. I think part of it is the arrival of fentanyl. One of the things, you know, I actually had a friend in the medical community who said to me a couple of years ago, he said, you know, he basically predicted that at some point we were going to start to see some of these synthetic compounds, fentanyl and carfentanil and some of the other derivatives, which are basically chemically produced. Yeah. You don't need poppies to do this. Yep. You don't need agriculture. You can make it
easy to mix in.
Right, and very dangerous and far more deadly than heroin by itself. And I think and that's part of the reason why we've incorporated some public safety initiatives into some of our later efforts, because we really believe you got to be aggressive about dealing with the fentanyl question, because you won't be able, even if you reduce the number of prescriptions, even if you increase treatment, even if you create a smarter community on the prevention and education side, if we start to see more and more of these sort of homebrew compounds coming into the system that are far more deadly than anything anybody's seen before, we're going to have huge issues with respect to overdoses, even though I think we've done a pretty good job with the availability in Narcan, which has been a great public-private, local, state initiative.
You talk about the treatment. We've spoken to families of people who have been affected by the opioid crisis who say, you know, lives can just be thrown away if they can't find a treatment center. You've made more beds available. Do you think you have made enough available? And do you also think that enough is being done for people once they leave detox?
Yeah, I think the big problem we have, and it's a challenge, and we recognize it, is what happens after people come out of inpatient treatment. Because, you know, the long story short there is we can provide treatment capacity, which we've done for a lot of people, but we also have to get smarter about how we get people to stay in treatment once they are no longer in any kind of secure facility. And that one, people are experimenting with a variety of approaches, most of which involve coaches and in some cases people who are in recovery themselves, but almost like the equivalent of a buddy system with some sort of regular check-in to help buck people up and help them stay clean. And I think this is an area where my participation in the national conversation on the commission is important, because one of the things we're recommending to the feds is that they put some serious money into what works, what doesn't, and why with respect to the whole treatment piece, because that is sort of a big part of how ultimately we get out of this. And the fact that Partners Healthcare is putting about $25 million into trying to get smarter about keeping people clean and sober after they come out of an inpatient setting, and the Greiken Center over at Boston Medical Center is chasing the same thing. You know, those are exactly the kinds of things that we need to do. But I would argue that we are not as smart as we should be about this, and that this is sort of a big challenge for everybody.
So much goes into getting the person treatment, getting them in. Maybe a little bit more needs to be focused on what happens when they come out.
Yeah, there is not good evidence on this, and it came up in the hearings we had in Washington on the President's Commission, which was a lot of people talked about the fact that we spend a lot of money on stuff that doesn't necessarily work, and probably not as much as we should on the stuff that does. But you could just listen in the crosstalk between and among the experts that even they were debating right there in front of us what they thought was most important. And I definitely believe that, especially for opioid addiction, you have to be thinking about some sort of an approach to this that appreciates the fact that people need their freedom, but there needs to be some mechanism to establish continuity. And I've been out and visited a bunch of sober houses, which are sort of the equivalent of group living settings, typically with anywhere from literally 10 to 20 people, all of whom are pretty heavily involved in trying to stay clean. And we've certified the vast majority of those in Massachusetts. But the ones I've been in, it's really interesting to hear these people talk about how they buck each other up, help each other stay committed. Almost all of them are working. I mean, they have jobs, they can pay rent. It's not, they have cars. It's not like there aren't options here for them. But the thing that really seems to matter most to them is the connectivity they have to other people who've been there and done that.
They have a community.
Get where they're at and are part of the community that they can benefit from participating with.
You mentioned the Presidential Commission. You wanted the president to declare a national emergency. He did so in August. Obviously, it hasn't been a lot of time, but have you seen any change since that has happened?
Well, our hope and expectation is when the final report comes out this fall, he'll use that national emergency as a device to drive some of the recommendations that don't require legislation. I mean, for example, why are we the only state in the country where you have to take a course in pain management and opioid therapy to graduate from medical school, dental school, pharmacy school, and nursing school? That's the sort of thing the federal government could make a requirement for everybody. They could do the same thing with respect to requiring everybody who's currently a prescriber as a condition of their license renewal to take and pass a course in opioid therapy and pain management. Because frankly, the vast majority of the people who write these prescriptions don't have any formal training in this because it wasn't part of what they were taught when they were in school in the first place, which is a big problem. When
you mention this report and when you mention the president, you haven't always been his biggest fan. I think that's kind of saying it lightly. Do you think the president is sincere that this is a top priority for him? Well,
when he talked about putting this together in the first place, he talked about his brother who had a terrible problem with alcohol. And his own kids have talked about the fact that their dad doesn't drink, has never touched drugs, and made very clear to his kids that a big part of his personal view on that was driven by his own experience with his brother. I think this is something that's important to him, and I do believe that the Commission's recommendations will get the attention they deserve, and it's certainly my hope that they get implemented. And there are certain things the federal government can do that you just can't do at the state level, because you can do bits and pieces of it at the state level, but the feds just have much bigger levers.
When you mention you mentioned the people that you've met over the past couple of years who have been affected by the opioid crisis. I can imagine when you meet with these families and you hear some of the stories and you hear the things they've been through, there have to be a couple things that just stick with you and sort of drive you and act as motivation for you. Can you share maybe one story that has stuck with you?
Well, there are many, but I'll tell you I'll tell you two stories. One is I was coming out of a federal courthouse, and I can't remember why I was in there. I think there was a charity event in there.
Okay.
And one of the court officers came up to me. This guy's about my age, and just handed me a letter and said, "I want you to read this." And so I put it in my pocket, and I got home that night and I opened it up, and it was a letter that is daughter had written about his son, her brother, and talked about, you know, our parents did everything right. They brought us up the right way. They looked after us. We had great childhoods. We played sports. My brother got injured. He was prescribed opioid medication to deal with the pain associated with the injury. He got sick, and she just goes on about the agony associated with trying to help him get clean and stay clean. And at the end of the letter, one of the things she says is he's actually now in prison, but all of us are sleeping better at night because he's in prison, because we know he's safe. We got to the point where every time the phone rang, we thought it would be somebody calling us to tell us he was dead. And because he is safe, we have hope. And I've called that guy several times over the course of the past year or so.
The guy in prison?
No, the dad who gave me the letter. Said, how's your son doing? What's going on? And, and knock on wood, he's out, he has a job. He seems to be, knock on wood, again, doing okay. I haven't talked to him for a couple months. I'll call him sometime soon to just check in and see how it's going. But the pain that family been through was just there in that letter, word after word after word. And this whole notion that you would be relieved as a family member because your family member was actually incarcerated because they would be safe, and you wouldn't have to worry about the phone ringing, at least while they were there, and hope that you could help them deal with this when they came out. It's pretty powerful stuff. And
shows the level of desperation for some families.
Oh my God, absolutely. And the second story would just be, I sat in I've been to a number of Learn to Cope meetings. Learn to Cope is a peer support group for parents mostly, and family members who are dealing with, kids and family members who are dealing with addiction. And I went to one night in Cambridge, and one of the guys there said, I'm from Cambridge, but the first time I went to one of these Learn to Cope meetings, I went to the one in Salem because I didn't want anybody I knew to be there. This is about the stigma issue, right? So he goes into the meeting in Salem, and he sees two guys he knows from Cambridge in the Salem meeting. And everybody sort of laughed a bit, and then several other people told similar stories. We still have a huge problem here with respect to people's willingness and ability to just speak publicly about this. And that's important, because a big part of, I think, how we get to where we need to go ultimately in dealing with this is having people truly understand and appreciate what people go through on this and why it's so important that we support them and commit to solutions to help them get better.
It's interesting, the two stories that you chose both involved dads and what they're going through. Do you think some of that is because
I'm a dad?
Yeah,
probably. I also think it just has something to do with the fact that I'm a parent. You know, I had two boys who played football, one of whom, both of whom got hurt, but one of whom actually got very hurt and ended up taking a ton of pain meds, and without anybody ever saying anything to us about what the negative implications might be of this, and knock on wood, by the grace of God, it just didn't stick with him. And I really feel in some respects like the Baker family got enormously lucky there.
Yeah, that's one of those things that, who knows, if it just clicks the wrong way, now your son's part of it.
Well, it's sort of a nature, nurture, neighborhood thing in some ways. You know, it's just your physiology to begin with. In some cases, it has something to do with issues associated with your environment, and for some people, they just come through it and it's okay. But for a ton of other people, without the knowledge and the information to begin with to understand and appreciate the positive and the negative of this, it can lead to some pretty awful and tragic consequences.
What is the priority, do you think, for our state?
Well, I think the big thing is to stay on the stuff that we've done and recognize and appreciate that you don't get out of a problem like this in a year or two when it took 15 years to get into it. Remember, the drop in deaths in the first 6 months of this year, that's the first time that number's gone down year over year in 15 years. Went up every single year by double digits for 15 years in a row. Same with prescribing patterns. I think it's really important that we get smarter about the part you and I talked about after somebody comes out of inpatient. You know, what works and what doesn't, and how do we create a best practice model with respect to making sure people have the capacity and the ability to be supported as they try to stay clean. I also think this whole approach to getting a lot more aggressive about dealing with street drugs, and especially with fentanyl and carfentanil and some of these really deadly compounds that have worked their way into the market, has to be a big part of our approach at this point going forward too. To simply ignore the fact that we now have some very dangerous, really deadly compounds that are finding their way into the street market on this, and to not do something about it would be a big mistake, which is why we filed legislation to have Massachusetts adopt the National Drug Register, so that as these compounds become known and available, they automatically become illegal in Massachusetts. The way it works now in Massachusetts, if one of these new carfentanil, for example, is not illegal to sell in Massachusetts.
Really?
Yes, because the only things that are illegal are the things we actually pass laws that specifically identify, which is a mistake. We should just adopt the Federal Register, and you don't have to use everything that's on it, but once you adopt the Federal Register, as these new compounds become available, we can then just say, new compound, administratively, it's now illegal, police can chase, DAs can prosecute, and bake it right into the way we try and deal with the street drug issue.